Try like.
Welcome to another edition of Fight Back Interviews, the About Fraud series that shines a light on the people, the passions, and the human stories driving our industry forward. And to provide this content, we need some kick-ass supporters. This Fight Back interview is powered by Sardine. Sardine is a behavior-based fraud and compliance platform. It helps merchants, marketplaces, and financial institutions fight fraud using data, machine learning, and decades of experience to build capabilities that detect zero-day scams, fraud, and sophisticated criminal activity. Join the fraud squad by heading to sardine.ai. Now, let's get into it. Thank you for jumping on our Fight Back interview. Really excited to talk to you. We've known each other for a bit, and some of the things we're going to dive into are pretty cool here. So before we keep going, why don't you do just a brief intro of yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Frank McKenna. Live here in San Diego, California. I have a company that's called Point Predictive, but I also have a hobby which is called Frank on Fraud. So I like to write stories about fraud trends, and put out a newsletter as well. So really love learning about fraud, talking to other fraud fighters, and then writing about it. And that's what I do with Frank on Fraud.
Awesome. And I think that's when I first got introduced to you, was the Frank on Fraud blog. And pretty much everybody I talk to, it's towards the top of their list of things to read related to fraud. So thank you for that. And, the first question is less fraud related, more about your background. So you're going to be one of our coaches for Fraud Fight Club Round 2, our conference. And as part of that, we're building profiles. It's basically like an advisory board. And one of the things we asked you was, what is something interesting that folks don't know about you? So I'm going to spill the beans here. And you told me you came from a family of 12 kids, which is super, super interesting. So kind of plain and simple question is, what was it like to grow up with 11 brothers and sisters?
Different. I don't think anybody can understand what it's like to grow up with so many brothers and sisters unless you've kind of lived through it. Not many people have. I'll just share with you some of the odd things that I grew up with. The first, maybe this is kind of gross, but we had one toothbrush that we all shared. So it was just in the bathroom, and you just brush your teeth, and then everybody else would use the same one. To me, that's normal, but that's kind of unusual. The other thing that's unusual is transportation. So there were 12 of us, and we all went to church together. We went to Knott's Berry Farm, amusement parks, the zoo. We all went in one car. It was a big car. It was a gold Cadillac. And me and my 4 brothers, we all sat in the passenger front seat, and we had to wear the seatbelt. So there'd be 4 of us in the seat, and they would strap the seatbelt across us. All eight of my sisters sat in the back with my mom. So we were tight squeezed in that car going up to Knott's Berry Farm in LA, 2-hour drives. It was just crazy. Another funny thing is when you come from a family of 12 and you go out in public, people don't realize you're all in the same family. We went up to, again, it was Knott's Berry Farm, and my dad bought some fudge, and he wanted to share the fudge with us. So he had us all line up in a line, and he was we all lined up, and we got a piece of fudge, and then we went on. But he was giving out the fudge, and then all of a sudden we looked back, and there was like 40 people that weren't part of our family lining up. They thought my dad was passing out samples, and that's why there was a long line. So we had just crazy things like that, things you wouldn't even expect. It was a lot of fun, but also kind of strange when you're looking on the outside in.
Yeah. I have 2 sisters, so a family of 3 kids. And it's just, beyond like 5 or 6 even, I'm like, you double that, I have no idea what that looks like. But the stuff you said makes sense, safety in the car, just get that seatbelt across everybody and see how it goes. And the one toothbrush thing, I definitely would not have thought of that.
There was another funny story. My dad didn't even remember all of our names. So he used to call me, he used to string all the brothers' names one after another because he knew if he just shotgunned all the names out, he'd get the right name. So my name growing up was my name was Bill Frank Danny Patrick. That's my older brother's name and my two younger brothers' names. So that's what my dad called me, was Bill Frank Danny Patrick. And he always got my name right. It was in there, the second name.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So that was
My mom
another.
would shout my sister's names and then mine and because she only had three to choose from, and I'm a guy, but she would still not get them. But she didn't have an excuse. Your dad had 12 kids, so that
12.
makes sense. That makes
We had
sense. Okay.
sisters. We had sisters. Some of my older sisters had moved out of the house and were in college and married when they had sisters that were just being born. So
That's
they never
wild.
actually lived with some of my sisters who are very young,
It's
because
wild.
they already moved out of the house. So we have that dynamic too, which is kind of
Yeah.
funny.
And listen, that's what I mean. We're talking about one specific thing, but people working fraud prevention come from all different types of backgrounds, educations, careers. I mean, that's
Mhm.
life, right? But especially in this industry, I think, because a lot of people don't study it in school. They get thrown into it, and that kind of leads into my next actual fraud fighting question. Is you starting in fraud in the year 1990, which incidentally was the same year that Seinfeld premiered on NBC, my favorite
Yeah.
show of all time.
Mhm.
So pretty simply, I think it's hard for people to think back to that time before digital banking, kind of everything in branch, and still checks, still lots of checks. We do that today. But what did you love about fighting fraud back then, and what did you hate?
Let me start with what I hated, because there wasn't much. 30 years in fraud, there's not much that I hate, but there was one part of my job back in 1990 that I really didn't like, and that was the fraud department. We had to double as the bomb squad. So if I worked for a bank and we'd get bomb threats, and when the bomb threats came in, we had to put on a yellow vest, and the fraud analyst had to go out and search for the bombs under desk and in lockers and in the kitchen and cupboards. We had to wander the three buildings of this credit card bank and try to find the bomb. And I just thought that was like the most ridiculous thing. I had no formal training in it, but here I was, looking for bombs. It was just one of those odd things that you did in fraud. I guess they gave you all the security tasks. That would never happen today, by the way. I'm sure they
No,
have
no, no.
specialists.
That's also blowing my mind.
But what did I love about the job? I loved the fact that they put me at a desk. I had a phone. It was just a phone that you picked up the receiver and you actually dialed. This is so long ago. And old computer. And on the first day on the job, I just remember being able to call a suspect who had ripped off one of our customers and stolen their credit card. And I was able to find this suspect who did it. And I was able to call them and kind of interrogate them and try to get them to give the money back, and also kind of yell at them a bit. And I just found that was just a thrill that I got the opportunity to talk to suspects that had committed fraud. And I was only like, 22 years old, and they entrusted me with doing something like this. Again, something that probably would never happen today. But on my first day on the job, I was already doing that, I was just thrilled. I loved
Yeah,
it.
the latter I can relate more with, where you kind of getting started and you're just kind of figuring out the red flags and talking to fraudsters on the phone. I feel like that can translate closer to modern time, but going to look for bombs, I cannot relate with that one.
That's right. When I started in fraud too, I remember some of the ladies in the fraud department, they had just disallowed smoking in the building. Think about this. This is like back in the 90s. People they used to work fraud cases and they'd light up a cigarette and just be smoking a cigarette while they're working cases. You can't even think of this now, but I remember a few times like some of the ladies would be like forgetful and they'd actually light up a cigarette, sitting next to me. They'd light up a cigarette while we're
Wave,
working fraud
waving
cases.
smoke away.
It's just,
Yeah,
some of this
yeah.
stuff is just crazy.
Yeah, it's and yeah, I think smoking anywhere. I remember going to baseball games back in the day at Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, and my dad being like, "Oh, put that cigarette out," because you could smoke there, but he's like, "I got my kid with me."
Oh
So I
yeah,
guess it
yeah,
depends on
yeah.
how old you are to how often you were in places where people could smoke. But I didn't
Mhm.
get the office one. I did not get the office one.
It was.
Um, so so then you moved to a solution provider and built and led fraud consulting at HNC, but then it was acquired by FICO. Um, and that's a different animal. So I'm curious what you learned there that was different than when you were working at the bank.
Yeah, I think when I worked at a bank, I think when you work at a bank and you work there a long time, you start to believe that, wow, we're doing the best. We're we're like the best because we invested so much time in our systems and our rules, and you really start to think you're great. And when I got to HNC Software, which is a solution vendor, then I was able to go out and I was actually able to see 50, 100, 200 different banks and finance companies and lenders and their fraud departments. And I got to see this, wow, expansive view into fraud. And I get to see what works and what didn't work. And that was just so eye opening to me to go from bank to bank to bank to just get a glimpse into their operations. But one thing that I learned through that process, which is super interesting to me, is that most banks had the same fundamental problem. And it was this: they would invest. The agency system was an AI neural network, very expensive solution to implement and to pay for, right? For good reason, because it stopped so much fraud, like millions of dollars in fraud. They would implement the system and then they would hire temp employees to go into Falcon, we called it. That was the name of the product. And they would basically let the temp employee who had no experience in fraud completely override the system and decide not to call a customer and to keep the account open. And this just was so surprising to me that you invest all this money, you have all this technology, and then you let somebody off the street who has no experience just override it completely. And this was so common. Big banks, bank after bank was letting this kind of phenomenon occur. And I think it still happens a lot even in today's world.
I completely agree. Trusting the score, right? And
Yeah.
that's, I think there's, the human investigator needs a score, not 100%. If you could just set it and at a certain threshold, you could just approve or decline everything. But so there is gray areas, but I think it's important to understand the technology that we have, the sophisticated techniques that are being used by that technology, whether it's rules or machine learning. There's and if it's tuned right, then it should be very helpful for fraud investigators. Definitely not totally overriding. You know.
Yeah, definitely not overriding. And the thing that struck me is that you'd have bank one who didn't let underwriters and fraud analysts override the score. And their results would be really, really good. And then you'd go into another bank who had using the same solutions, right? And
Mhm.
they had really high fraud losses. And that was kind of the fundamental thing was the bank that trusted the score, not 100% like you say, but at least most of the time, they had really good results. So your ROI with a fraud solution can really depend upon how it's used operationally. And
Definitely.
that's where the whole consulting, where I really got into consulting, was just telling banks how to do these simple things. It's amazing what people would pay me to tell them the simplest of things, right? It's like,
If it
eh,
adds value, it could be simple. Somebody else is not advising it, so you're adding value. So
mhm.
yeah, and that gets into kind of a tech company and a solution provider which you founded, Point Predictive. So not all fraud fighters go on to do that. There's so many different paths. So my question is, why did you make the leap from kind of what you were doing there with FICO to being a tech founder in the fraud space?
Yeah, I think like a lot of fraud analysts and fraud experts, if you work for a solution company, you start to see where the gaps are with technology because you talk to a lot of banks and lenders. And kind of that's what me and my partner, who's Tim Grace, he's the co-founder of both the companies that I started with him. And we saw that there was a big gap. We were focused on credit cards at HNC, but we saw that there was a big gap in the industry using consortiums, data consortiums, and artificial intelligence built on those consortiums. to do pattern recognition and stop fraud. So letting banks collaborate with each other with a third party and using machine learning to identify the patterns in the industry level data. So that's why we started. We were like, let's just take the same consortium approach and see if we can start new companies, take a time tested technique and apply it to mortgage lending, which is what we did. And then we worked with MasterCard and we built a consortium for them at the time. And then we built, Point Predictive. We've been really focused on auto and fintech. So the same approaches work across industries. And that was our general hypothesis and approach for creating these new companies.
Yeah. What was the day to day like different? Like you own this or you're starting this company with a partner, which I think we've talked about before. It is very helpful and kind of having different skill sets. But I guess what did you like? What were you good at, and what did you kind of need help with?
Yeah. So I think the first thing when you start a company is you realize, number one, that the biggest issue is getting people to give you money, whether it's investors or customers. Everybody is willing to, and super nice, by the way. You'll find that when you start a company, people are willing to give you meetings, but it's another thing to get money from them, to sign contracts, and you're small. That part was really, really difficult. You can have the greatest idea, but if you don't know how to monetize it, to describe the value, to be big enough to work with the bank, right? To be solid enough where they trust you. That was a very different issue. And that's why I was not good at that side. And my partner was, he's a brilliant at being able to create products that can be monetized and can add economic value. So that's where he really
But that's great,
shined.
right? That's the
Yeah,
balance you need in co-founding partners, teams.
that's
People
right.
excel in different areas, and being
That's right.
willing to say, "Hey, I like this. I'm good at this. Have the confidence in it, and I'm not as this isn't my strength. You are good at this." So,
That's
not
right.
having trying to have too much control over it and saying I can do everything.
You can't. The best companies are built with partnerships. It's hard to start a company alone. It's
Yeah,
very rare to find individual partners because you need complementary skill sets. And I
definitely.
highly recommend it.
Yeah, yeah, and it's okay. I think people, high achievers especially, are like I got to be good at everything. No, you don't.
You can't.
Especially if you own a company, right?
Mm.
No, you don't. Speaking of advice, I guess we'll say good or bad, and skills, good or bad. What is the worst piece of professional advice you have ever got?
This was I get two. So the first was, hey, you should get into sales. You'd be great at sales. That was horrible advice to me because I never, ever wanted to be a salesperson. I hate sales. I'm glad I didn't get into sales. Yes, I could have made money probably, but I would have dreaded my life going to work every day. So I'm glad I stuck with kind of fraud and just stuck with kind of being a domain expert through all the years. I think the second piece of bad advice I got was in college. I was an English major, and the head of the English department saw my writing and he says, "You need to not write again. You are horrible at English grammar and you should change your major." And I actually listened to that advice and I changed my major because I thought, wow, I'm really not good at writing. And it took me many years to understand that their perception of, writing being grammatical, that was very narrow because I
Yeah.
love writing and now I write all the time. So another piece of bad advice that unfortunately I took that one.
I love that, but you learned from taking it that it was bad advice, right? And that's part of it. You're not always going to know good advice from bad advice. So I love the writing one because it's so true. Yeah, grammar, punctuation, certain ways of writing, but to be creative, to connect with people, which is what I think you do with Frank on Fraud. You give good content. It's relatable. It's
Mhm.
interesting. And
Yeah.
being entertaining is really, an important part of it. And it doesn't need to be super over the top, but people got to want to sit down and read it. Like it can't be a 50-page essay that is just dry as anything. At least not for the type of writing that most you and I do.
Yeah, that's true. And you bring up a good point, which is I think a lot of companies make a mistake with their marketing when they create blogs and they create white papers and they create content for the industry. It's written and it's very boring and it's very dry. There's no pizzazz to it because it's very conservative, but it's also semi unreadable. People don't like it that much. So I think marketing and not all companies, because some companies do this very well, it has to be relatable to a broad audience and it has to be interesting. It can't just be dry and unreadable.
And
Because
feel
then,
like a human wrote it, right?
like a human wrote it, like a practitioner can read it. It's just interesting, right? It has to be interesting.
And sometimes an image does that. Sometimes you throw like a good image or a good GIF or a good like these are all just keep you engaged. Like we have very busy day jobs that sometimes require reading monotonous things and going through emails and Slack channels and stuff. It's nice if you're going to spend your free time boning up on some topics to have a little entertainment there, a little interest, and you can still be smart and credible. I think that's what people think in the B2B world. Like, oh, I'll be too, I got to be all buttoned up and
Yeah,
and that's not always the case.
that's not the case. And you know what? 99% of people only read the headline. So you got to have a good headline because their whole article may just be on the headline and the image that's associated with it on LinkedIn, especially. I see people, sometimes I post things and I'm like, they make a comment, but they haven't actually clicked and read it. They just put the headline and the image, and that's fine. But you didn't know they don't need to spend a lot of time writing 18 paragraphs. Most people won't read 18 paragraphs. So they'll
I
read
know.
the headline in one paragraph.
Some people don't even read a whole post. Like I'll get a comment and I'm like, you didn't get to the end of the post. you know?
No, you didn't get to it, but you got the feeling
You
across.
got the
People
feeling
knew
of
what
it.
you
And,
were
and that's
what
not the
you were talking
majority. And it's no, and that's just consuming content 30 years ago, I'm sure was way different. I'm sure people's attention spans were different. I'm sure the way their brains function was a little different, that long
about.
ago.
Very.
Cool. So, hey, we're gonna get wrap up with a couple last questions, and this one is: listen, I know you're not retired or done fighting fraud, but I'm curious when people look back at the career of Frank McKenna and Frank on Fraud and all the great things you do, what
Mhm.
would you like people to remember?
I think I want people to remember that I was helpful. I think being helpful and being reliable is important to me. If somebody needs some information, I'm able to provide it. If they read a blog post or something I do on LinkedIn and it was helpful to them to be able to get investment or to be able to tell other people in the company about a new trend, that's what I want. I just want to be known as a helpful person and somebody that if you asked something of me, I would be available for you. So that's what I want to be remembered as.
Love it, love it. Can't
I
really add
probably
anything
won't
on.
retire. I probably will never retire. Nobody in my
Yeah,
family ever
yeah,
does.
I know. The Frank on Fraud blog will be going, until you
Yeah,
can't type on the keyboard anymore, maybe.
maybe.
Um, No, I mean those answers are great. It's not this amazing technology I founded or this supreme award I got or this accomplishment. It's two simple words that mean a whole hell of a lot. So that's awesome.
Thanks.
The last question is something I ask all my guests, which is this is called fight back interviews. Intentionally because fighting fraud is hard. So fighting back and continually getting up back off the mat again like a boxer and fighting back is interesting to think about. And the question is, what keeps you fighting back? What keeps you going?
There's so much that keeps me going. It's just, to me, it's the thrill of the chase. It's the thrill of finding a fraud, being onto a fraud when you're looking at a loan or you're looking at a report. It's the thrill of finding a new trend that you never knew about before, whether it's on Telegram or Instagram or YouTube or anywhere. The ability to find that and understand it. I love the thrill of that, of writing about it, of putting it out there and having people read it. I like the adrenaline rush every day of never knowing what's going to happen next in fraud and putting things together like a puzzle. it's such an interesting profession that what you do today and tomorrow and the next day and the next month is always going to change because you have all these forces all over the world that are changing what's going to happen. And we're right in the thick of it. And we're able to help make sense of it all and fix it and help people we love and help companies we want to help and help countries in the industry. It's just such a great profession is to be an anti-fraud fighter.
Yeah. And almost like what makes it hard to, keep going sometimes, what makes it so difficult is the things that makes it interesting too. The changing, the dynamic fraud attacks, the all of that is can wear you down, but also it can keep things fresh and interesting and exciting. And so that's actually what can drive you as well.
Yeah, and you meet a lot of, I think in fraud, unlike many other professions, you're going to run across people that are very empathetic. I think people that are very empathetic to the human plight and to victims, they're naturally drawn to fraud. And I think you're going to run into a lot of that in fraud. So those people are really, really understanding. And I like that as well. That keeps me coming back because there's so many good people that I meet in anti-fraud. And so there's some
Yeah.
medicine in it. Like,